So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at Catherine Mansfield's short story, The Fly. We've already had one lecture on this, and so we'll just pick up from where we left last time. So we had seen how this story is interestingly about equating trauma with privilege. In other words, the ability to be traumatized, the ability to experience trauma at will, is equated with privilege and sort of masculinity, because the boss in the story, the protagonist in the story, was never named, but it's just called the boss, which is also an indication of his masculine privilege. He prides himself, as we'll see in shortly, he prides himself at being able to feel traumatized at will. He prides himself at being able to be weep at the loss of his son at will. So trauma is interestingly sort of performative in a story. It's a performative category. Hysteria is a performative category. And interestingly, you find that normally the association with hysteria is with femininity, that this stereotypical sexist association with hysteria is with femininity, with females. It's only women who get hysterics, according to that sexist logic. But over here, we find there's a masculine appropriation of hysteria, and the boss takes over hysteria. He becomes a mourner. He's someone who wants to mourn at will at the loss of his son. So, and we've also seen how he hasn't literally moved on from his loss, so he doesn't want to move on from his loss. And his inability, not inability, but this refusal to move on is obviously his struggle to hold on to the original moment of trauma, which is, as I mentioned, equated with privilege. Now, we've also seen how there's a complete counterpoint to this character of Woodfield, who appears in the story, who's senile, who's old, who's decadent, is almost dead, and we are told that his mobility, his agency have been compromised post the war. I mean, he's had a stroke, is obviously very, very sick and unwell, and he's boxed up in his house by his wife and girls. He was confined in a house by his wife and girls. So his mobility is compromised, his agency is compromised, and not just his social agency, but also his motor agency, his motor control is severely compromised, in the sense that he shivers all the time, he can't make movements at will, etc., and how that becomes complicated. But then he's an important character in the story, because he mentions something the boss wants to completely be in denial of, and that it's been 7 years, and he's lost his son in the war, just like the boss did. But his wife and his daughters go and visit a grave in Belgium, and again, interestingly, we've seen how the description of the grave is very touristic, sort of gaze that is there at the grave is a very touristy kind of a gaze. It's a very consumerist kind of a gaze. So it becomes almost like trauma tourism, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, where people go to the graves of the beloved sons and daughters who had lost their lives in the war and see the graves in a far-off land, in Belgium in this particular case. So the boss's son is also buried there, we are told, but the boss, for several reasons, have never been across. And this, obviously, the several reasons is very, very indicative, it's very loaded. It's also suggestive of the fact that the boss doesn't want to move on. The boss doesn't want to go to the site of trauma, but he wants to retain the psychological experience of trauma. So looking at the actual site of trauma will obviously dilute the experience of trauma that he suffered many years ago. And this ability to re-suffer it, this ability to re-experience it, is something which is equated with manly privilege in the story. And that's the whole point, that he wants to hold on to this original traumatic moment. He wants to hold on to his original traumatic experience. And this ability to hold on, this refusal, this defiance of time, is something which is equated with this manly privilege, with this bossness, so to speak. So Woodfield mentions this trauma site to the boss, and he also mentions, and we also get to know as readers, the same graveyard where the boss's son is buried. And this begins to turn the event in the story. This begins to really form some kind of a peripeteia in the Aristotelian sense, a reversal of events, a turn of events. So the boss begins to get more and more cracked up, more and more fragile, right? And the fragility of the boss becomes very obvious. The fragility beneath this tough manly masculinity, this tough manly exterior, begins to become very obvious over here. And we also get to know, we also realize how this entire embodiment of the boss is a constructed embodiment, that how he's been sort of performing the idea, the embodiment of the boss, performing the appearance of the boss, as tough manly appearance, beneath which is very, very vulnerable, beneath which is very, very insecure. Okay. So this is the point in the story where Woodfield departs after delivering the report, and we get to know as readers too that boss's son is dead, Woodfield's son is also dead, and they're all buried together. And that's something which was not told to us. Although, if you remember the very beginning of the story, when the boss is showing off his gadgets, his new office, his furniture, electric heating, bookcase, etc., we got a little glimpse of something. It's a blink and miss situation where there's a little photograph of a boy in a soldier's uniform in the table, and we were also told that photograph was not new, that was there for 6 years. Right, so we were sort of wondering, we're supposed to wonder what that photograph meant, or whose photograph that was, and what was it doing amidst all this new architecture in his office. So that was a very quick and very subtle pointer to what's to come now. So now that we know Woodfield lost his son in the war, and also the boss lost his son in the war, we can connect the dots, and we can perhaps guess that photograph may have been the boss's son, who's now dead in the war. So maybe he's kept in the office amidst all the new architecture, new gadgets, new machines that he's surrounded by at this point of time. So Woodfield goes after departing this news. So this should be on the screen, and this is the point of the story where it begins to get very psychological. For a long moment, the boss stayed, staring at nothing. So again, the blankness in the stare becomes important, and you can also read it as he's staring at nothingness. There's a very nihilistic, emptying kind of a gaze. He's staring at nothing, the blankness of stare, and also the stare at nothingness. While the grey-haired office messenger watching him dodge in and out of the cubbyhole like a dog that expects to be taken for a run. So again, look at the animal metaphors in the story. The dog, the rabbit, and we've seen Woodfield was infantilized. So the point is, everyone is sort of subhumanized or dehumanized in different degrees in the story. So amidst other things, among other things, the story is also about the loss of humanity. I mean, that's supposed first of all the story. This is the crisis in humanity in the Western world. The white man's toughness, the white man's supremacy is being questioned increasingly, and the boss becomes in a way the archetypal white man in the Western world, who's sort of trying to hold on to his erstwhile privilege, trying to hold on to his erstwhile superiority, supremacy, racial, gendered supremacy. But that's obviously thrown on the question. That's obviously cracked up. That's obviously fragile, or that's something which we quite clearly know now. Okay, so he's sort of becoming more and more crushed at the moment. So the white-haired grey office messenger watching him dodge in and out of the cubbyhole like a dog that expects to be taken for a run. Then, "I'll see nobody for half an hour, Macy," said the boss. "Understand? Nobody at all." So again, the boss gives very clear instructions that he will see nobody for half an hour. So he wants to be alone. He wants to sort of isolate himself in his room, close the door, and perhaps re-experience. We see very quickly that he'll try to go back to his original moment of trauma. But interestingly, we find that even the office messenger, he has a name, Macy, right? Woodfield has a name, Woodfield's son has a name, Woodfield's wife has a name. But the boss and his son, they don't have a name, and they don't have names, so we never get to know what his names were. And there are many interpretations that are possible out of this, but one obvious interpretation is the unnamed condition of the boss and the son obviously gives it some kind of an archetypal structure. The boss is that patriarch, the white male, Western white male patriarch, who wants to control the business, who wants to control the family, who wants to control the war, who wants to control everything, the capital, the finance, the family, culture, etc. And the son, who's also unnamed, is the next in line, so he's supposed to be the next boss. So the son and the boss, they have some kind of a dialectical relationship in some sense, because the son is supposed to become the boss, and the boss obviously is performing the idea of the boss, the embodiment of the boss, right? So these become, the son and the boss become very archetypal performative figures, trying to fit into this masculine roles in a Western capitalist world. So the boss becomes the patriarchal structure, the patriarchal figure in the story, the grand patriarch, the grand capitalist Western patriarch in the story. But the point is, with the son dead, it becomes interesting, it becomes tragic, because the line of patriarch is now interrupted, is now permanently interrupted. So the boss will never become, the son will never become the boss. In other words, there will be no boss again. So the boss is essentially dead as a concept, as an embodiment. He's a dead man. He's just, a hanger-on in time. So he's someone who's essentially futureless, because the son being dead, There will be nobody to take over his business. There will be nobody to become the next boss, right? So that becomes an interesting temporal crisis. There's nothing to look forward to. There's no future in terms of what the boss is, right? And that temporal crisis becomes interesting because, as I mentioned, the whole idea of defiance in the story is defiance against time. So we will get to see very quickly what the boss will say. That, he had promised himself that other men might live the lost down, other men might move on with time, but I will never move on with time. And this defiance to move on in time becomes the assertion of his masculinity, the assertion of his manly privilege, his agency, which obviously will now get more and more deconstructed. Okay, so this is the point where he very ceremoniously tells Macy, the office messenger, that he will not see anybody for half an hour, and then he gives instruction and goes to his room. The door shut, the firm, heavy footsteps recrossed the bright carpet. The fat body plumped down in the spring chair, and leaning forward, the boss covered his face with his hands. He wanted, he intended, he had arranged to weep. So again, look at the sequence over here. It's almost a concatenation of gestures and intentions. So he goes back to his spring chair, he covers his face with his hands. So the very performative quality of mourning becomes very interesting. He goes to his office, shuts the door, gives very clear instructions, very ceremoniously, that he'll not see anybody for half an hour, and he prepares himself to cry. Right, so the performative quality, something which I keep talking about, the performative quality of mourning, is equated with the performative quality of masculinity. So he becomes the ideal manly mourner because he can mourn at will. He can, historicize himself at will, and his ability to historicize himself becomes a marker of agency. It becomes a marker of masculinity for the boss, which is what makes the story interesting. So again, if you look at the sequence, he wanted, he intended, he had arranged to weep. So it's very artificially arranged. So the door has been shut, the office has been decked up. He's created, he's engineered this isolation around himself, and this engineering of isolation becomes obviously part of the performative process. That he's going to isolate himself, he'll feel alienated, and then he'll weep. Okay, and now we get a flashback in time. We get to know what was the boss, and what was the boss's intention, who was the son, and how was the son brought up, and the entire tragedy of the incident of the son's death. It had been a terrible shock to him when old Woodfield sprang the remark upon him about the boy's grave. It was exactly as though the earth had opened, and he had seen the boy lying there with Woodfield's girls staring down at him. So again, this very visual image becomes interesting, this very graphic visual image, where he almost imagines that the grave of the son gets opened up, and Woodfield's wife and daughters are gazing at him, gazing at the son. Now, what obviously that means is, if the grave is a trauma, if the grave is a symbolic traumatic site, or the trauma site for the boss, it suddenly becomes open for public gaze, and that's something which is unnerving him, because he wants to protect it, and he wants to sort of solemnize it. He wants to solemnize his loss, solemnize his trauma, and he wants to be completely private. He doesn't want to be that to be accessible by the public. But now this whole idea of Woodfield's wife and girls staring at the boss's son, and the boss's son obviously becomes the marker of the boss's own trauma. So there's also a gendered quality about this gaze. If you read this carefully, it's almost as if the earth is opened and he has seen the boy lying there, but Woodfield's girls staring down at him. So it almost becomes a Medusa-like stare, right? It converts you into a stone, and this is a literalization of a metaphor because it is literally a stone. It's literally a coffin, right? And the boy's son is obviously dead for many years. The boss's son is dead for many years. So that woman staring back at the man, it almost compromises his masculinity. It almost castrates him as a man, and because the whole idea of his masculinity was premised on privacy, was premised on this mournability, was premised on this inaccessibility. Right? So he is inaccessible to the public, he's inaccessible by time, he's inaccessible by the public temporal gaze, which is equated with femininity over here. Other men who are not man enough might live the lost down. Other men who are not man enough might travel, do tourism around the trauma, but not him. He wants to retain the original moment. So now with the image of Woodfield's sons, Woodfield's daughters and wife staring at the boss's dead son is essentially the woman staring at his manly grief. That obviously compromises his masculinity, that opens him up. It cracks up the coffin, and the earth opening up becomes, again, it's like a chink in the armor opening up, and that becomes engendered invasion in the boss's psychology. For it was strange. Although over 6 years had passed away, the boss never thought of the boy, except as lying unchanged, unblemished in his uniform, asleep forever. So this is a point where we get to know the ideal image that the boss has in his mind, that his son should be there asleep forever. He's retained the original moment of trauma. He's retained the original dead body, or the original moment of death. It's been 6 years, but the boss always wanted to think of the boy, his son, as lying there unblemished in his uniform. So nothing has changed, nothing has decayed, right? So the deadness is fresh in his mind. It's almost an organic quality about deadness. It's fresh in his mind forever. My son, groaned the boss, but no tears came yet. And this is where it becomes almost tragicomic. It becomes very dark. He wants to cry, he wants to relieve himself, he wants to have the catharsis, or the satisfaction of catharsis by crying, but then no tears are coming. So he's performing, he's trying his best to perform, he's desperately trying to perform his catharsis, he's desperately trying to perform his mourning, but no tears came yet. In the past, in the first months, and even years after the boy's death, he had only to say those words to be overcome by such grief that nothing short of a violent fit of gripping, weeping, would relieve him. So he only had to say those words, my son, and you just come with this violent fit of weeping, which would relieve him. So again, the whole idea of weeping becomes, like I mentioned, very, very cathartic in quality, and it's very selfish catharsis. He wants to relive the moment of trauma, and by reliving it, he's relieving himself. And so those whole entanglement of relieving and reliving becomes interesting. He wants to relive the original moment of trauma, and that gives him relief. That gives him a sense of solid manly satisfaction that he's able to sort of relive it at will. He's able to go back in time, transport himself back in time, and re-suffer the original moment of trauma. And that gives him a sense of pride, and which will come hubris over here. Hubris is obviously a Greek term, which means that pride which brings about your downfall, that pride which essentially flattens you and ruins you, essentially. The vanity, the selfish pride, the dangerous pride. And that hubris is becoming quite evident over here, as is mentioned in the next sentence. Dying, he had declared them, he had told everybody, could make no difference. Other men might recover, might live the laws down, but not he. So again, this is a classic hubris of the boss. Other men, who are lesser men, might recover, might move on, might live the laws down, but not he. I mean, he is this big man, he is this patriarch, and his loss is special, his loss is unique, his loss is most traumatic. So he can never live down his loss, he can never live down his trauma, he can never live down his personal grief, and that is something which he takes pride in. It's almost like a very pathological quality over here of pride, and this hubris becomes interesting, it's quite evident. Okay, but not he. So how could he? He can never live his loss down. That was something he declared publicly. He told everyone. Again, he made a public statement, very ceremoniously. How was it possible? His boy was an only son, so it's almost as if he's the only father to have an only son to die in the First World War. So the uniqueness of his trauma is something which he is telling himself in his mind, that my loss is so unique, my trauma is so unique, my mourning must be most unique, and I must be able to perform my mourning ad infinitum. I must never stop. I must be able to perform my mourning over and over again. Ever since his birth, the boss had worked at building up this business for him. So again, this very capitalist patriarchal framework is beginning to make its presence felt. So ever since the son was born, the boss had built this empire for the son to take over later, subsequently. It had no other meaning if it was not for the boy. Life itself had come to have no other meaning. So this whole production of meaninglessness becomes important over here. That's the tragedy of the boss. The production of meaninglessness, the experience of meaninglessness, the fact that the son's life, the son's death, has not just become a tragedy for the boss at a existential level, but also becomes a temporal and business meaninglessness. So temporality has stopped. Time has stopped for him, and he wants to believe that. He wants to hold on to that belief that there's no time for me at all, because the son's death is the end of time for me. It's almost apocalyptic in its momentum and its magnitude in his mind, this apocalyptic quality of tragedy over here. So, life itself has no other meaning. It's completely meaningless, and the production of meaninglessness becomes important for him. Now, how on earth could he have slaved, denied himself, kept going all these years without a promise forever before him, or the boys stepping onto the shoes and carrying on where he left off? So again, this is what I meant a little while ago when I mentioned that the son's death is essentially the death of the boss, because the son was supposed to be the next boss. And the fact that both of them are unnamed gives it a degree of archetypal quality. They become the almost allegorical archetypal figures, the son of the boss. So the son is the next in line to become the boss, and he will have his own son, presumably, who will then become a boss. So the death of the son is the death of the line. There's an interruption of this temporal quality, and that's something which the boss, that is the biggest tragedy for the boss. The fact that, it's got no other meaning, it's got nothing to look forward to. It's the whole productive process has now been permanently interrupted, and by productive process I mean obviously the collusion between kinship and capitalism, the collusion between patriarchy and capitalism. Because the boss over here is quite clearly a capitalist. He's a hyper-capitalist patriarch. He's built an empire, he's got his financial structure, he's got his magnificent office, but then the whole point is to transfer that to his next male heir, right? So this almost like a kinship system of maleness, where the next male carries on from where the older male leaves, and it just extends the empire. But that possibility of extension is now interrupted. That possibility of extension is now gone, completely gone. Okay, and that's the tragedy in the boss's capitalist patriarchal imagination. That is a tragedy. That there's no possibility of a new boss taking over, right? So symbolically, that's the death of the boss, so to speak. Okay, so the promise was before him that the boy is stepping into his shoes and carrying on where he left off. And that promise had been so near being fulfilled. It was so close to being fulfilled, right? The boy had been in the office learning the ropes for a year before the war. Every morning he had just started off together. They'd come back by the same train, so it became a routine. The boss had been training the son to become the next boss. Every morning they'd come together, sit in the same train, come back in the same train. And what congratulations he had received as the boy's father. No wonder he had taken to it marvelously. As to his popularity with the staff, every man jack of them, down to old Macy, couldn't make enough of the boy. And he wasn't in the least spoiled. No, he was just his bright natural self, with the right word for everybody, and with that boyish look and his habit of saying simply splendid. Right? So this is the backstory we get to hear now, that the boss had been training his son to become the next boss. He had brought his son. He used to bring his son every single day in the office for him to learn the ropes, and the boy was picking everything perfectly. He wasn't spoiled. He was very popular. He was very charming. Everyone loved him, and he had his boyish look, and he would say simply splendid. Right? So they had this manly, boyish optimism about productivity, about masculinity, and that optimism, the simply splendid thing, is obviously a very, very masculine expression. Simply splendid is like a Boy Scout expression, right? And that the Boy Scout quality is very evident. So the boss had been scouting the son, or grooming the son, engineering the son to become the next boss. And the son was almost there. He was very close to becoming the next boss. He was very close to taking over as the next capitalist, right? So the productive process, that engineering process, the grooming process becomes very evident over here. He used to come every single day, learn the drills, go back in the same train. Everyone loved him. He was very popular among the staff. All Macy's loved him, and he wasn't spoiled at all. He would just carry on with this bright, productive optimism and say simply splendid every time he was pleased. But all that was over and done with as though it never had been. So it had all come to a grand halt, a grand suspension, just one massive ending, one fell swoop, everything fell down. The day had come when Macy had handed him the telegram and brought the whole place crashing about his head. Deeply regret to inform you. So that letter, the very common template where parents and family would be informed of the death of the soldiers, just one template with the same thing for everyone. Deeply regret to inform you. So it's a very pet expression, it's a very matter of fact. So that deeply regret to inform you, that expression is a very military expression. It's like a template for everyone. And that was sent out, disseminated indiscriminately to everyone who lost their sons and daughters and beloved family members in the war. West sent the same template, deeply regret to inform you. There's a very business-like detached quality about that template. And that obviously carried the news of the son's death. The son was dead in the war, maybe died in the war in tragic circumstances. That was conveyed to the boss. So the telegram had come in, and Macy had brought him to his office, brought that telegram in his office, and that essentially brought the whole place crashing about his head. The entire space fell down, the entire architecture fell down, collapsed, because, you know, the sun's death, as I mentioned, is a very symbolic decimation of the entire architecture. So the entire empire that the boss had been building is about this patriarchal project of the sun taking over subsequently. And with the sun's dead, the entire project collapses. So the spatial quality becomes interesting over here. The spatial metaphor becomes interesting over here. The entire space crashes on the boss's head. So that's something I want you to understand. The space metaphor is that the crash of the entire building, the crash of the entire empire, the crash of the empire, the crash of the entire episteme, the entire structure. And obviously by structure, by episteme, by empire, I mean the entire projection, the fantasy of the boss that, you know, the sun will take over from where you left off. And that fantasy, the projection, is now just completely killed, completely decimated with the biological death of the sun. Okay, and he had left the office a broken man with his life in ruins. So again, there's almost a bombing metaphor, right? It's almost like a bomb fell on the building, the bomb fell on him, and the entire space collapsed, the entire building collapsed, the entire building was crashed. It's like a bombing. So the violence of war is obviously projected and described in different terms. It's not just about the people who are dying in the war front, but how that death is generating its own violence, its own unique violence in a civilian space, right? So when the message comes in a civilian space, when the message comes in the office space, the entire building collapses symbolically, essentially, because, you know, that bombing metaphor is something that I want you to spend some time with. So the whole place was crashed about his head. He just left the building as a bombed man. He left the building office a broken man with his life in ruins. So again, ruins and the crash, all this becomes spatial metaphors. Ruin is spatial metaphors, a metaphor of space, ruined space, abandoned space, right? So that spatial quality is something that I want you to understand a little bit. And obviously we talk about the temporal quality too. There's no future for him to look forward to. There's no sun to take over his business. So the entire tragedy, as it were, becomes the spatiotemporal quality. The spatiotemporal quality of tragedy becomes important because it's an interruption in time. There's no time for the boss to look forward to. There's nothing for the time to flow into. And the entire space has also collapsed. The architecture has collapsed. The building has collapsed. The empire has collapsed. And the episteme has collapsed. The knowledge system of the boss has collapsed. Okay. So he left the office as a broken man, his life in ruins. 6 years ago, 6 years, how quickly time passed. It might have happened yesterday. So again, the temporality is interesting, how quickly the time had passed. The boss took his hands from his face. He was puzzled. Something seemed to be wrong with him. He wasn't feeling as he wanted to feel. So again, the ability, the aspiration to control his feelings, the desire to control his entire temporality, feeling, emotion, is part of the manly package. He wants to control how he feels. But then he's begun to realize he's not in control of his feelings anymore. He's begun to feel a bit strange, out of his comfort zone. Something seemed to be wrong with him. And this is the beginning of the fall of the boss. This is the beginning of his fall out of his hubris, the false pride that he can control time, that he can control his emotions, that he can control his mournability, that he can control his tragedy. That false pride is now beginning to get decimated. He wasn't feeling as he wanted to feel. He decided to get up and have a look at the boy's photograph. He wants another trigger. So it's almost like he wants that trigger to come to him, for the satisfaction to happen, for the catharsis to happen. But it wasn't a favorite photograph of his. The expression was unnatural. It was cold, even stern looking. The boy had never looked like that. So he doesn't get the desired satisfaction. So you can see how it is almost like almost an erotic quality about this psychological situation. He wants to get sadness out of it. He wants to get grief out of this, but there's also a pleasure component in the grief. So there's a sadomasochistic quality about this entire aspiration, this entire psychological situation. And the sadomasochism will now be dramatized in the next episode in the story, the Fly episode, which we'll cover in the next lecture. So I'll stop at this point today so we can begin to see how it's begun to become very psychological, very complex. He wants to get grief out of it, but that same grief will also give him satisfaction of the knowledge that he can still control his emotions, that he can still control his mournability, he can still control his tragedy, and that knowledge will give him satisfaction. So there's a very interesting entanglement between grief and satisfaction, between the cruelty and pleasure, and that's something which we'll see in the next episode, the Fly episode in the story, which we'll cover in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.